You are listening to Trump Republic Radio. It is June 1st, 2017. As always, I'm your host, Enzo Quesada, joined by my co-host, Bobby Hester.
Hello, everyone.
And this week we have on a very special guest. We've been trying to get him on for like the last week. There's been a little trouble, but it's all right. But someone that I consider a friend and someone who represents a cause that I think is very noble and important in the world. And he's been touring the entire country. And he's been on many very prominent right-wing shows talking about his cause, and that would be Simon Roche of the Suidlanders.
Hello, Enzo. Hello, Robert. Thank you very much for having me.
Before we get into it, Ariel wanted to say hi. She wanted like a shout out on the show, and she listens to the show. So,
hello, Ariel. How are you?
But Simon, why don't you tell us a bit about yourself and why you have come to the United States?
Enzo, I represent Suidlanders, which is a civil defense organization constituted under international law, under the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions, which make specific provision for civil defense organizations in times of armed conflict. And Suidlanders is the world's largest non-state civil defense organization. We are devoted to the protection of civilian non-combatants in the event of an armed conflict in South Africa. And the purpose of touring the United States is to raise funds, firstly, in what we believe is a last-ditch attempt for us to finalize our preparations, or to raise funds and to make purchases to finalize our preparations before an armed conflict begins in South Africa. Obviously, these things are difficult to tell, but numerous international experts and numerous black leaders in South Africa would concur, in as much as many people are predicting this civil war, this armed conflict in South Africa. We are not alone. We're not paranoid, neurotic, or hysterical. There are many very good reasons why we believe that it is imminent, and therefore this is our last chance, we believe, to raise funds for that purpose here in the USA.
Just how bad is the current situation in South Africa, just in case no one knows? Because I don't think most of the world even has an idea that there's any sort of problem going on.
Well, the situation is quite severe in terms of the collapse of the economy. Our unemployment figures were released yesterday or today. I'm not sure. I'm a bit confused by the difference in the time zones. And the official unemployment rate is 38.1%. We have a severe crisis in our sovereign bonds. They've been downgraded to junk. So those are economic factors, and there are many more of them. In terms of social unrest, I was showing somebody last night, somebody here in Ohio, where I am at the moment. We'll be giving a talk on Saturday at the VFW Center in Northfield, and one of my hosts was looking on my phone at the emergency text message system that we get as leaders of Suidlanders. We have our finger on the pulse of everything that's going on in South Africa, and he just couldn't believe it. He couldn't believe that in one day there could be so many riots, protests, burnings, torchings, pillagings, and so on. So that is the social unrest facet of it. And then the third facet, we've already addressed a little bit of the economic aspect of what contributes to this looming threat of some sort of cataclysm. The third facet is the open threats of black leaders on this subject. I'm just trying to think carefully now, but in about August of last year, our former judge president, in our legal system we have what's known as a judge president, said that South Africa is facing an imminent race-based civil war. In October, one of our leading political analysts, also a black man, stated at the launch of his book, the book that he just had published, that South Africa was on the cusp of a race-based civil war. On the 7th of November, one of our most influential political leaders, a guy by the name of Julius Malema, the head of the Economic Freedom Fighters political party, a sort of, I would say, a Stalinist party, stated in the town of Newcastle in the north of the province of KwaZulu-Natal, the historic homeland of the Zulu people, he stated that I'm not calling for the slaughter of all whites yet. And as one of our most important traditional leaders said to me, in other words, I can't give his name, unfortunately. I think I might have mentioned it to you guys in one of the presentations you attended, but obviously publicly I don't give his name. The leader of a very important kingdom said to me, in your culture, Simon, a statement like that could mean many things. But in my culture, when somebody says, I'm not calling for the slaughter of such and such people yet, it means that the person's loyal followers should get ready to execute a slaughter. On the 10th of April, I'm hoping that all of these anecdotes will go some way to convincing people who know nothing that there is a very good supply of evidence for why we should be concerned. On the 10th of April, a mayor of what we call a metropolitan, which is about 5 cities bonded together so that the wealth can be distributed between them, it's a sort of a quasi-socialist thing, stated that if conservative whites don't stop complaining about the sovereign bond rating downgrade to junk. Our sovereign bonds, as I said to you, were downgraded to junk by Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's. If conservative whites don't stop complaining, they will be wiped out and there will be none left in 5 years' time. On the 21st of April, the Julius Malema, whom I mentioned earlier, stated that the government should now give black people access to white people. In other words, he was saying the government must step aside and let us have a go at them in the spirit of retribution. He spoke at length about retribution for this and retribution for that. So these are open threats of main force, what's called in legal terms main force violence. And there are many more, but hopefully that will suffice to answer your question, Enzo.
Yeah. So in South Africa, you are a Boer, is that correct?
No, I am not. I am of Irish stock. So I'm not our country's white people are split about 60-40 between the Boers. The Boers are the majority of the white people in South Africa. They are the people whose ancestors came to South Africa in 1652. And then you have English speakers. And the English speakers are divided up amongst Englishmen, people from Britain, historically from Britain. And then you have people like me who could be Portuguese, Lebanese, whatever, but white people who speak English. And in the case, I personally am of Irish extraction. I'm one of the few English-speaking people in our organization. The Suidlanders is an organization devoted first and foremost to the protection of the Boer people in the event of an armed conflict. I happen not to be, and there are various reasons why I am so loyal to the organization. There are various reasons why there are few English-speaking people, but that's a synopsis.
Because I remember, because I went to the New Braunfels and the Austin presentation. Sadly, Bobley couldn't go to either. But you went to great lengths to actually tell us the history of the Boer people in South Africa, because most people don't realize that, you know, the Boers, which make up the predominance of the Suidlanders, have been in South Africa for hundreds of years.
Yes, that's perfectly correct. The first white settlers in South Africa arrived on the 6th of April, 1652. The second wave came about 2 decades later, and then 1 decade again after that, the third wave. And those three groups coalesced to become what is now known as the Boer population, which is a very, very distinct genetic group. I'm sure you will remember me telling you the anecdote of the Indian scientists who were doing genetic research on young Boer women, and the big controversy around it. And those Indian scientists said that the reason that they chose Boer women and not American girls or Samoans or Australians or Russians or whatever is because the Boer population, according to them, breeds the most true to type of any genetic group in the whole world, which is quite an interesting thing.
Yeah, because we did an episode on the Suidlanders, I believe about a month ago, and we went through a lot of different quotes of black African leaders talking about the Boers in particular, and they would say like, you know, that they're settlers, that they need to go, even though in a lot of instances they predate black living in the regions that they're talking about.
Yes, if you drew a squiggly line through South Africa from the mouth of the Great Fish River on the east coast of South Africa, it's a bit difficult to convey this concept over by voice alone, but about 40% of South Africa, 45% of South Africa had never been inhabited by black-skinned people at the time that the Boers arrived in the Cape of Good Hope, and there they met the Aboriginal people, the small, frail little Bushmen and Hottentots, who had been fleeing from the black-skinned people. In other words, the black-skinned people were coming down the coast of East Africa over a long period, over many hundreds of years. They had been in South Africa, what is now modern-day South Africa, for some time, but they'd never advanced beyond a certain point. And the only people beyond that certain point when white people arrived were the Aboriginal Bushmen. In other words, people who'd been there for thousands of years as opposed to anybody else, black or white. And people who'd been murdered, practically a genocide, almost a complete genocide by the black-skinned people. So about 45% of the country had never, ever, ever been populated by black people when white people arrived.
And yet they believe that they have some sort of claim to white land, and they're openly calling for the redistribution of white land.
That's right. A deadline has been given of the 3rd of August, and if all white land is not in black hands by the 3rd of August, supposedly there is going to be big trouble. That is the threat that has been made by the radical blacks, which, by the way, are not a peripheral, negligible, inconsequential number. They are I would say that the proportion of the black population which by American standards would be considered left liberal would be close to 70, maybe 80%. So when these guys are talking about taking all land, the popular sympathy is overwhelmingly with them. It's not just a few guys making these utterances. In fact, even our state president has reopened the land claim process, which is something that happened some years ago where people were able to go and claim historical lands. And he has said, now we will not pay for anything. The whites must just give the land. So people apply, they say, well, Enzo is a horrible white man, or his great-grandfather came along and he beat up poor little Simon Blackman's great-grandfather and he stole his land. And then if the government agrees, then you take my land away from me, as simple as that. So there are two things happening in parallel. The one is a legal process, but without a compensation. So it's just expropriation. And the other is a paralegal process.
Really crazy stuff. But I remember you told us just how violent South Africa is, which it's much more violent than any average nation in the world. Mm-hmm. But really what is calling a lot of y'all to organize is just the prevalence of violence against Boers. I know Boer farmers, they experience, it's one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. Could you tell us about some of the violence that's going on?
Yes, the officially the highest amount of death in any how can I, well, let me put this a different way. Hang on. This maybe make more sense. It is 13.7 times more likely that a white person in South Africa will be murdered by a black person than that any American will be murdered. In other words, a 3-year-old girl in South Africa has 13.7 times greater chance of being murdered by a black person than you, Enzo, have being murdered by anybody. What is called the danger multiple of white people being murdered by black people in South Africa is 0.44. The likelihood of a American soldier dying on the front line in Vietnam. Let me explain that for those people who are not maths prodigies. An American soldier in Vietnam stood a certain chance of dying. Now, this is a young guy who's gone off to war. Any white South African, including a 90-year-old granny or a 2-year-old boy, stands almost half the chance of being murdered by a black person. We're talking about soldiers in front-line combat versus civilians minding their own business at home. I'll give you another example. The Boer farmers in South Africa stand more than double, and this, by the way, is a statistic which only emerged recently in our parliament. So it's a very sensitive statistic that nobody wants to talk about, but which is 100% true, and it's in the parliament and what have you. A Boer farmer stands 2.02 times the likelihood of being murdered by a black person as a member of our police force stands of being murdered. And we have one of the highest police murder rates in the world. So in other words, in South Africa, it's more dangerous by double to be a farmer tilling the soil to feed the country than it is to be a policeman in one of the most crime-ridden societies in the world, where there are something like an estimated 2 million illegal weapons, 2 million AK-47s, Tokharovs, Makarovs, and other illegal weapons that were brought into the country by the African National Congress during the war against South Africa in the 1980s.
It's really incredible stuff that just no one even has any sort of frame of reference to even imagine that for American society. If we had a murder rate, like you said, of something like 13 times over, this would be a national crisis that everyone would be talking about at the moment.
Yes. Yes. Well, you add 2 zeros to get percentage. So if your murder rate increased by 1,370%, it would be a phenomenon like the world had never ever heard of. It's happening in South Africa, but nobody's talking about it. If it was happening in the USA, it would be on the front page of every newspaper morning and night, and it would be the first item on every news report on every news station all day, every day. It is a phenomenon beyond people's comprehension.
And I know you gave us during the presentations a couple of examples of attacks on these Boer farmers and just how grotesque they get. And I know it's affected your family, like, personally. Would you mind maybe telling us a story or two of just attacks that have happened, just so people have an idea just how violent these things get?
Enzo, it's my pleasure to tell you a story or two, although I should tell you that I always have qualms when I tell these stories, because I'm always afraid that people will think that they're exceptional, that they're egregious, that they're isolated incidents, that I've used the worst of the examples. So for whatever it's worth to you and your listeners, I would just like to state for the record that I could keep you here all day and all night long with other examples of this of phenomenon. There are thousands upon thousands of stories. Be that as it
Oosh, your audio cut up for a second.
The brutality and the viciousness. Are you okay, Robert?
Oh, yes.
Could you repeat what you said maybe a couple seconds ago? Your audio broke up.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. Is it stable now? Is it good?
It's fine.
Yes, it is now.
Okay, my apologies. I was just saying that here are some examples of the viciousness and the brutality of these attacks, which may be in suburbs. Some of them happen in on farms and so on. Recently, a woman went to pick up her child at school in the evening, and she was accosted by some. This is in central Johannesburg, very well-known high school. Elon Musk attended this high school. And she was accosted by some men and dragged onto the playing fields, and they raped her. I believe it was 4 men that raped her. And when they were finished with her, they took a broomstick and used the broomstick on her, and her internal wounds were so severe that she died. This is picking your child up from school that you get raped by 4 men and a broomstick. About 6 weeks ago, no, a little bit longer than that, perhaps 10 weeks ago, if I'm not mistaken, a woman was tied to a chair, a 60-year-old woman tied to a chair. She was accosted by 4 men who tied her to a chair in her house when they invaded it, and they took a Black & Decker drill and drilled through all of her major joints, beginning at her ankles, knees, thighs, wrists, elbows, and shoulders. And she died of her injuries. Another story that I can tell you is of a young girl who was crucified to her parents' kitchen table after they'd been murdered in their farmstead. And then she was raped, and she was found in that crucifixion pose. Another story that you're already familiar with is the story of a young girl whose parents were murdered in their farmstead, and then the girl was raped. She was 4 years old. She was raped by 3 men, and once they'd finished raping her, according to the poured petrol on her and set her alight and burned her to death. It's worth noting that in traditional culture, it is believed that the sexual intercourse, not necessarily rape, but sexual intercourse with a virgin cures AIDS. So therefore, there's a sort of a double incentive on top of this pervasive criminality that is experienced throughout South Africa and has been experienced rampantly since the African National Congress Party of Nelson Mandela took over on the 27th of April 1994. Over and above that, there's an added incentive for men to rape virgins, because we have a tremendous rate of HIV and AIDS infection. I was chatting to somebody the other day who's quite knowledgeable on this subject, and they said that 1 in 6, if you can believe it, it's incredible to believe, but 1 in 6 people in South Africa has HIV, is HIV positive. I have a close relative who is a very senior medical officer at a particular institution. I wouldn't like to give his details or the details of his institution, but he is very senior, and it's a very highly respected institution. And he said to me a couple of years ago that the rate of HIV infection amongst the people who enter that hospital is over 25%. It's 26 point something percent. Now, you can imagine for yourself how many millions of people that equates to who've got this HIV and who may believe in their traditional culture and sincerely believe that the witch doctors know what they're talking about, and that the right thing to do is to find a virgin and have sex with her as soon as possible. Now, let's say the guy is poor or ugly, or he has no appeal for women or whatever, and he can't find a girlfriend, or he's already married, or whatever. What is left to him? He's almost compelled to rape, to find a virgin to rape. People don't like to speak about these things, and it's very, very, very sensitive. But these are truths. These are absolute truths. Last week, a farmer in the province from which I come was attacked with a pitchfork and not killed, and he was set alight by the robbers, and then they left. But this is a common thing, it's not an uncommon thing. There are many anecdotes, and if you want to know more stories, just ask.
Yeah. I remember, because I've looked up a lot of this stuff online, and I've done a lot of research in the situation, just reading stories where they go to rob someone's house and they don't even bother to take anything. They just end up just savagely murdering the people in the house and cutting them limb to limb or setting them on fire. And it comes from a place of hate, not even to take anything from the whites, it seems.
Well, that's absolutely correct, Enzo. And, I think that some of the things that we say here in the USA must seem incredulous or incredible, I should say, to Americans. If I was an American and people were telling me these things, I'm not sure that I would believe them. You almost have to go to South Africa to fully experience for yourself just how vicious these incidents are. And you are perfectly correct. In a huge proportion of the incidents of rape and murder in people's houses or on their farms, nothing is taken, or just a few odds and ends are taken, maybe a cell phone and a vehicle. The house is not plundered for everything that it's worth. One of the techniques that's now being used, because security is such a big thing in South Africa, as you can imagine for yourself. Many people have dogs and tall walls around their houses with barbed wire, what we call razor wire. It's not exactly barbed wire, it's a bit more lethal than that. And then perhaps with electric fencing inside of it, and dogs. So what the guys are doing now is feeding poison to the dogs, dipping meat in poison, and then flicking it over the wall, waiting for the dogs to eat it, watching perhaps through the gate from a distance until the dog sort of collapses, and then they'll find a way over the wall or through the gate or over the fence. So there is a sort of a, you could say that there's a mastery of this viciousness. It's become not quite an art form, but it's become perhaps a craft. It's very highly developed. And then, as I say, people will enter and they will do whatever they do, perhaps rape, perhaps murder, perhaps this, perhaps that, and leave again. About 74,000, just over 74,000 white people have been murdered by black people since the dawn of our utopian, as the mass media would have it, our utopian new South African rainbow nation democracy that began 23 years ago on the 27th of April when Nelson Mandela took over the reins of power.
Yeah. I remember when we did the show, we went through some studies that were done on the attacks, and they would even, they record statistics on the uptick in attacks after, black African leaders would make these kind of anti-white claims, and there would be huge upticks by like 130% in some instances, just compared to the normal terrible incidences. So when they really go off on these hateful quotes where they go to their rallies and they say this and they have no fear of repercussion, it just gets worse, because when the people hear it, they just take it for word. They see it as almost like an order to go out and do this stuff.
Yes, Enzo, it's pleasing for me to hear that you and Robert have done that sort of research, because it helps me to know that there are other people who genuinely appreciate the severity of this thing, independently of me saying so. But you're perfectly correct. There are numerous studies that have been done which reveal that whenever there is anti-white rhetoric spouted by black leaders in South Africa, there's an immediate increase in the number of crimes, these hate crimes, murders and rapes and what have you. It's quite an interesting phenomenon, actually.
And also, I remember last time we talked in Austin, just a couple days earlier, there was those big riots in Coligny, South Africa, which were really, I thought when I saw that, I'm always keeping my eye on South Africa if this pops off. I really thought that could even been a starting incident, so it's really getting so crazy, especially with that last incident in Coligny.
a very good point. We as Suidlanders have been head and shoulders the most accurate forecasters of developments in South Africa, simply because, well, for two reasons. Firstly, we're not hidebound by doctrine. In other words, the majority of organizations in South Africa, whether they're liberal or conservative, are very hesitant to condemn anything about the new South Africa. Whites feel guilty. They feel guilty for their success, they feel guilty for the history, they feel guilty for everything. And so it is that even conservative organizations tend to make predictions and forecasts that are diluted by political correctness. However, we don't have that constraint, firstly. Secondly, our organization was founded by a man called Gustav Müller, who was a very successful military intelligence officer in the South African Defence Force, and he specialized in forecasting, in making predictions, which is obviously what one does in situations of conflict such as there was in South Africa, particularly in the 80s and the early 90s. And so the organization is steeped in that scientific approach to these things, and there are four areas that are of greatest concern to us. I won't enumerate them over the air if you don't mind, but Coligny, that town, to give it the sort of original French pronunciation, or Coligny if you prefer, falls directly in one of those areas. And the conversation that I held last night with this man from Ohio, to which I alluded earlier, included the three other areas. So right now we are seeing in South Africa violence, protests, burnings, lootings, and pillagings right now, as in today, in all four of the key areas which we believe will play the key role in setting off any major conflict. You can tell by the steady pace at which I'm speaking that I'm choosing my words very carefully, as I have to do.
Yeah.
That is not to say that we believe that the sky is going to fall on our heads, as it were, tomorrow. We don't say that. What we do say is that we have been consistently accurate in these predictions since they were begun by Gustav Müller, our founder, 16 years ago, based on military intelligence analysis methods. And we believe that we are going to continue to be accurate as long as we use these scientific methods of looking at this problem. And we believe that the threat of an all-out civil war, such as Dr. Gregory Stanton of Genocide Watch in Washington, D.C. predicted some years ago, is reasonably imminent. Whether it's going to begin tomorrow or the next day or in a week's time or a month's time or in 3 months' time is very difficult to tell. But so far, every forecast that we have made has been 100% accurate.
It's really something else. Could you tell us some about like the structure of the Suidlanders and how that organization works? Maybe go back to when it was founded and how it got to where it is today?
Yes, gladly. As I said, the organization was founded by a man by the name of Gustav Müller, who, by the way, will be coming to the USA in about a month's time and spending some time here and joining me in meeting important people, conservative Christian people in the USA. In 1996, initially the organization did not function as let's say, a full-on civil defense organization. And it took about 4, 5, or 6 years, I'm not 100% sure from memory, before the organization became what it is today. And over that 16-year period, since then until now, the organization has evolved into the world's largest non-state civil defense organization. We have about 18,000. We have about 12,000 fully active members, week in, week out, training, practicing, rehearsing. And that represents about 12,000 families. We have about another 6,000 members who are former members but in good standing. In other words, people who have been members of the organization for many years and who have said over time, right, well, you know, I'm moving away to a new town, or I'm doing this or I'm doing that, but, you know, in the event of a crisis, you may count upon me to become active once again. That 18,000 represents about 72,000 people, approximately 72,000 people, perhaps closer to 100,000, but I'm trying to be a little bit conservative here. It's always better to be conservative with these things, because then nobody can point a finger at you for exaggerating or lying. Those people fall into 5 departments in our organization. Those 5 departments fall under a headquarters. Now, at present, in South Africa, the Suidlanders is constituted something like, let's say, the Boy Scouts of America. We have little groups all over the country, and a few groups form a region, and a few regions form a province, and we have 27 provinces, as not officially in South Africa. I mean, within our organization, we have 27 provinces. And the organization is run much like the Boy Scouts. People practice and train and rehearse and so on. In the event that the crisis begins, the entire structure of the organization will transform immediately into the headquarters with its 5 departments, as I described to you. So, how that will be manifest is that, let us say that Robert, for example, belonged to a group in the far north of South Africa, and the criteria of the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions were met. In other words, if you, Enzo, see me walking along the street and you hate me for some reason, and you run up and you smash me on the nose with your fist, I can't say, well, Enzo has now declared war on my entire population group, on my nation. That is not how it works under international law. There are 4 phases with specific criteria. Now, once phase 4 is reached and all of its criteria are met, and there is a full-blown civil war between the races of South Africa, Robert will receive a series of messages telling him to get his family together and to urgently leave his town in the north of South Africa and to drive towards a safe haven. We have a ring of safe havens whose location I'm obviously not at liberty to tell you. So it's almost like a chain, a not quite connected chain, a series of small towns in a circle, approximately in the center of South Africa, loosely speaking. Now, Robert would make all haste with his family and his SUV and his caravan in tow. What do you call a caravan in America?
We say caravan
Like a trailer.
or maybe van.
Yeah, okay. So he's got his caravan on the tow hitch of his SUV, and in there he's got months of baked beans and tuna and whatever other preparations he's made. He travels with his family in a convoy of his own group, the group to which he has belonged all these many years. After some time, his group will coalesce with another group, like streams meeting to form a river. Though that enlarged convoy will then continue for a certain distance until it meets another convoy, and they coalesce to become a convoy that is bigger again. Eventually, they will reach a safe haven, one of these small towns, where under international law, we as a population group, as a distinct ethnic group, are entitled by international law to claim the protection of international law, to say, in this place, we, Afrikaners and white people in South Africa, Boers and other white people, non-combatants. The legal term is non-parties. Non-parties to the prevailing conflict. We wish to withdraw ourselves from that conflict and huddle together here with a perimeter around us which may not be penetrated. Assuming that the people in those safe havens, in those small towns, are then able to move safely again, they will go into one large area that we call a green zone in a certain region of South Africa. So there will be an influx from the outside inwards towards the center of this ring of small safe havens. In its center is a green zone, and we will try to get people there. Obviously, this thing has to be done in stages, because if we were to say to people, well, just jump in your vehicles and drive for 1,000 miles, there's a very good chance that they will be waylaid, that they will be obstructed along the way, that they will be caught up in the conflict. So it's better to do it in little segments, let's say. You might be wondering how that is coordinated. We have a nationwide matrix, a grid of HF radio communications across the whole of South Africa. And that system will be used to coordinate the movements of each of the convoys, each of the groups, the small convoys, larger convoys, and so on the safest possible roads. It'll also be used to coordinate camps. If it's better for people not to go any further, but to stop in a certain place, which may itself not be a safe thing to do, but it might be safer than to proceed further on in the event that there's a road blockade ahead. You may or may not know, Enzo, that 3 weeks ago, our government summarily withdrew 2,100 ham radio licenses, and we know that was specifically intended to hamstring our ability to coordinate this refugee effort. So for an outsider, that might be a negligible piece of evidence. But for us, it is a massive piece of evidence of this conspiracy to slaughter all whites, as the black leaders have put it so very explicitly. It's a bit like you're not married, so I can use this example, I think, without giving offense. But let's say your wife, God forbid, is having an affair. Or let me use a nicer example. Your child has become a miscreant at high school. Your child was very well behaved, then certain things changed. And the child gets into trouble at high school, and the teacher sends a complaint home, gives you a call and says that your child is causing trouble in the classroom. A week later, the headmaster calls you and says, we don't know what to do with this child anymore. And various other similar things happen. Then one day, you pass your child in in your house, and you smell that they smell tobacco on them. Under those circumstances, it's reasonable to assume that they are smoking. You know already that the child is up to nonsense. You know already that the child is hanging around with bad people. You know this, you know that, you know the other. Now, we as South Africans, specializing in this field of threat, understand that when the government summarily rescinds 2,100 ham radio licenses, this is not a coincidence, especially doing so without an explanation. We know, because we have our noses in the dirt, as it were, because we're at the coalface of this thing, we know that is specifically intended to hamstring our ability to coordinate a refugee flight in the event of an armed conflict in South Africa. Would you like me to continue describing the departments and how it fits together, or do you have a question?
No, you can go into further detail on how it works. I just remember from your presentation, you expected there would be a lot of people heading towards these safety zones that wouldn't make it there. Is that correct?
Yes, yes, that's correct. You know, Enzo, we believe that about 800,000 people, in other words, 1 in 6 white people in South Africa, will participate in our national emergency plan. And that is based on statistical modeling, computer modeling. Some people will not participate because they'll be too late as a result of their political orientation. In other words, dyed-in-the-wool liberals will believe that until their last breath that South Africa one day is going to be a utopia, and they won't leave in time. Other people will become trapped because the areas in which they stay are deliberately isolated, cut off by opposing forces. Other people won't make it because they'll become waylaid on the routes. We believe that about 800,000 people will participate in our plan, and we believe that of those 800,000, there is a possibility that as many as 50% will be slaughtered before they are in a position to fully function within our green zone, the safety zone. However, for those, sorry.
Oh, no, you can continue.
Thank you, excuse me. Within that safety zone, or let me first describe the perimeter of it to you. The perimeter will be held by able-bodied men. When people reach the perimeter of any of the safe havens that I described to you earlier, or the main green zone, men will be required, able-bodied men that is to say, will be required to remain at the perimeter and not to proceed further with their wives and children. If they do not wish to do that, if they believe that they have some kind of, I don't know what, democratic right to choose for themselves where they go and what they do and when they do it and how they do it and why they do it, then we will evict them from that safe zone. Not because we wish to see people injured, but because unless we have absolute discipline, we will be destroyed very quickly. We have no choice but to be firm. So able-bodied men will be required to remain on the perimeter while their wives and children and elderly parents and disabled, crippled, whatever friends and relatives proceed inwards. They will then be required to form a cordon on this perimeter that prevents attacks. Now, this, of course, leads to the matter of arms and armor and ammunition and blah, blah, blah. Let's get this out of the way once and for all. South Africa's laws pertaining to gun ownership mean, I won't go into them in detail, but they mean that we will be in possession of light arms only. It's just as simple as that. That's one thing to say. A second thing to say is that the Geneva Conventions, or more specifically the protocols additional to the Geneva Conventions, only permit the use of light arms. The third thing to say, so that everybody is clear, is that this tour of the USA to raise funds to protect our people is not for the purposes of buying arms, armor, ammunition. You can take that from me right now. And if anybody is in any doubt about that, if somebody out there is saying to themselves, well, talk is cheap, how do we know? Maybe he's lying. Let me tell you that the funds raised go into an account which is a legal trust account. In other words, we can't spend the funds how we want to spend them, even if we wanted to, or if we wanted to spend them differently, we wouldn't be able to do so. It is a legal trust account which is independently audited twice over. the funds are very, very, very tightly controlled, and the funds that we raise here in the USA, these funds for which we are pleading amongst the people that we meet in the USA, will be used only for diesel, medicine, to the extent of 90%, but also to a very much lesser extent, food, seed, water purification pumps and filtration systems, radios, communication systems, tents and related logistical items, and sleeping bags and other very minor items. So to get back to the point of what we were talking about, this cordon will be held with light arms as per the provisions of international law. No attacks will be made by us, otherwise we will lose the aegis, that is to say the protection, the aegis of international law at once, which would be rabidly stupid of us. We have to ensure that our little children, our mommies and our sisters and our wives are safe. The only way that we can do that is by being non-parties, by withdrawing from any conflict. And if a belligerent force, a force that is hostile to us, should endeavor to penetrate the perimeter of one of these safe havens or of our green zone, then we are entitled under international law, providing that we don't fire the first shot, and numerous other criteria to defend that perimeter.
Because I know you've been accused, I know on It's Going Down on Org they wrote an article saying that the Suidlanders
Yes.
are advocating for a racial civil war that they want to start, even though that's ridiculous. One, like, your laws in South Africa are so inhibitive of even acquiring guns compared to the United States. But two, you need to be so law-abiding to even let this organization run, because you're not allowed to have any sort of white-focused organizations in South Africa, but you're allowed to because you incorporated the Geneva Convention in your constitution, so they did something good in 1994. But I know...
Yes.
I know that y'all had some trouble when you went into Minneapolis because of the article that they wrote on It's Going Down on Org. The anarchists in the United States that we have, they're getting really bad, and I mean, I fought them personally in Austin. We're planning to do it again. But it's crazy just how, these people that they believe that, we got to protect minorities. The second that it's a minority that's white, they feel that they're supposed to just be genocided, that they don't even have a right to protect themselves.
That's the thing. And white South Africans form about 8.5% of our total population. We're about 4.7 million people. And our gross population is about 56 million. I was reading, nobody's certain because our Department of Statistics is notoriously inept, but I was reading today that the number is 54.9 million, but there's another source that says 56.2 million. Nobody knows. As long as the African National Congress government is in power, nobody ever will know. They're not, God bless them, but they're not extremely competent. However, the fact remains that we're about 1 in 12 people, about 8.5%, 1 in 12 people in South Africa. So for us to begin some kind of conflict would be, use the facetious words, but we would have to be thoroughly stupid to do that. Firstly, we don't have the weapons that our Army, Navy, and Air Force do. And secondly, we're in the overwhelming minority. And thirdly, the weapons that we possess are peanuts compared to the number of illegal weapons in South Africa that were brought in by the African National Congress. The African National Congress's armed wing, Mkhonto weSizwe, which means the spear of the nation, the armed wing of the ANC of Nelson Mandela. during the 80s and the early 90s. I mean, we're hopelessly outgunned, even if you take our military out of the equation. And we're hopelessly outnumbered. We don't stand a chance. We are going to be slaughtered. This is a fact. The Suidlanders is not an organization that says, we're going to beat up the bad guys and we're going to stand for our people and we're going to be victorious. Far from it. We are the first to say that we are going to be slaughtered en masse. En masse. We are going to be on the receiving end of an onslaught that will leave the world stunned by its viciousness. We are not hopeful and optimistic, except to the extent that we say, if we stand together as non-parties to a conflict, if we really stand together, stand in unison, then it is likely that some of our people will survive.
It's really crazy. But you bring up the ANC and Nelson Mandela, and I know here in the United States and globally he's praised as pretty much a secular saint. I mean, I personally don't believe that at all. But could you just, because everyone just sees South Africa as this perfect rainbow nation. I bring up Nelson Mandela, he's the greatest man to ever live to most people. Could you kind of dispel the falsehoods that are around maybe this image of South Africa that were presented?
Yes, well, the first thing to say is that after Nelson Mandela passed away in December of 2013, about 3 weeks after, if I remember correctly, I could be mistaken, but it was a short span of time after his death, two of his peers revealed that he had remained a member of the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party up until the day of his death. Nelson Mandela was a dyed-in-the-wool to the marrow of his bones communist. Let me say something else, which I hope, I don't expect to convert any liberals or leftists on this tour. Enzo and Robert, let me tell you now, I don't think that way, and I think that it's a mistake when people, whether it be in the USA or France or Great Britain or Germany or anywhere else, believe that they can convert people whose hearts are so liberal. It's a waste of time altogether. However, there are some people who should be on the right-hand side of the spectrum, but who sit in the middle. And I speak particularly of Christian conservatives. And so when I say this, in my mind, I'm speaking to Christian conservatives. Obviously, you guys know who is your audience, and you might have your own ideas about for whom this is most relevant, what I'm about to say. But speaking for myself, I have in mind Christian conservatives when I say many people don't appreciate that the ANC of Nelson Mandela, the African National Congress government of South Africa, is in fact 1/3 of the tripartite alliance. It is not an independent organization. It is 1/3 of an organization which is comprised of a radical trade union, an umbrella of trade unions, and the South African Communist Party. The ANC is not an independent organization. It's just as simple as that, whether people like it or not, whether they believe it or not, whether they think that Nelson Mandela had a charming smile or not, whether they believe in it doesn't matter. The fact is that the African National Congress is 1/3 of an organization. The African National Congress is what is known as the governmental leg of the tripartite alliance. The other, the Congress of South African Trades Unions, being the second leg, is responsible for activism on the ground, and the South African Communist Party is responsible for policy. And the Congress of Trade Unions and and the ANC and the South African Communist Party then feed into one another when it comes to the government. They feed in their members, they delegate their members, or as they express it, to use their term, they deploy their members into government roles. So they feed them in. So you, Enzo, might spend 20 years as a trade union activist, and Robert might spend 20 years as a professor of sociology or anthropology at a university, but all the while he's a member of the South African Communist Party. Then at a certain point, they say, right, Robert and Enzo, you guys, it's time for you to step up to the plate. We think you're mature enough and savvy enough and whatever, and we'd like you to stand as members of parliament in the government of South Africa, to stand in the elections. So you don't have to be a member of the ANC to become part of the government. The ANC as an independent entity, is a fairy tale. It's a fiction. It's simply not true. Whether people like it or they don't like it, it's not true. And that hopefully sheds some light for people who have been deceived, who have been beguiled by the narrative of the mainstream media concerning South Africa over the past 35 to 50 years on the true extent of the communist identity of our government. And that's why I began by saying that in my mind, as I say this, I think of Christian conservatives who believe the things that they're told by the Wall Street Journal, BBC, Sky News, CNN, ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS, all of these liars, but who in their hearts are genuine Christian conservatives who are anti-abortion, anti-this, anti-that, who are in many ways instinctively right-wing thinking people, but who have almost been bullied by 3 hours of television a day into accepting the thoroughly deceitful narrative of the media and of the left generally, of university professors and so on and so forth.
Yeah, the news has gotten so bad here in the United States and so deceitful. That's one of the motivating factors of us even having a podcast, because every single Sunday we do our news show, and it's just having to dispel fake news left and right, and these narratives, they go so far and they're so institutionalized where you try to shed any sort of light on reality beyond, and people just have no ability to even listen to you beyond it anymore. I've talked about South Africa to some people, and they just don't believe it's true. They can't even envision a world where whites aren't these oppressive, overruling people. But I mean, that's just the doctrine just being handed down in universities, and we're university students. I've gotten to witness this kind of rhetoric firsthand, and it's just it's overpowering. It's really hard to break through, and that's why you say, like, there are a lot of people on the left that could never be reached.
Yes.
The only people that could ever really be reached are the people on the right that should know the truth, but the truth's never put in front of them even.
Yes. I think that there is a large proportion of the non-right wing that is irredeemable, completely irredeemable, and I think that it is to a large extent genetic. I've been doing a bit of reading at Stefan Molyneux' instigation on RK selection theory. And besides, I mean, we know, the time has passed for arguing about how much of a role genetics plays in our behavior. That is an argument for yesterday, the day before, but not today. We know now there is an overwhelming body of evidence that makes it absolutely conclusive that the vast majority of who and what we are is genetic. Within that,
when we think of RK selection theory, you can't help but look at the left wing of the spectrum and say, well, I don't think that there's any hope for them. I really don't. I think that to the marrow of their bones, they believe that this nonsense, this perversity, this postmodernist, moral relativist, humanist nonsense. They have no moral compass, and they never will have a moral compass inside of them. They will always be moral relativists. But there are many good, decent, respectable people whose behavior is informed largely by media propaganda, fundamentally. You know, I don't know any of it, because whether they switch the news onto ABC, NBC, or CBS, it's the same lies. So they believe that it must be the truth. And if we can reach those people, we will have done something good. I, of course, only have one agenda to pursue, and that is to raise funds for the Suidlanders to purchase civilian vital necessities for an armed conflict. And I'm not proposing myself to pontificate, to sermonize on politics, but I think if young, sensible, energetic people with proper moral compasses will put your shoulders to the wheel, you can make a difference.
You're kind of breaking up, Simon.
Young women, simply because.
Could you say maybe go back like 5-10 seconds?
I'm sorry about that.
It's all good. You said like the energy of young people, that there's a chance.
Yes, what I was saying is that young, energetic, intelligent, sensible men like yourselves with moral compasses can make a difference, particularly in the lives of young women. And why do I say young women? Simply because one only has to spend time around the right wing in the USA to appreciate that it is dominated by men. And I think, there's absolutely no doubt that young women possess the same propensity for comprehending the truth as men do, but they're not being reached. For some or other reason, they're not being reached. Obviously, people like Brittany Pettibone and Lauren Southern are doing a fantastic job of speaking not only to women, but of course they appeal to women. Women like to hear what women have to say, and they're doing a great job. But for whatever it's worth to you, it's my opinion that it would be lovely if young guys like yourselves, with everything going for you to make a success of what you're doing, did continue your work, not give up, draw in more and more people, and it is a personal hope that a greater number or a greater proportion of those people will be women, that this message will reach women as it is reaching men in the USA.
Yeah. I understand RK selection theory pretty well as well, and I do think that there's a very big genetic component to it. So, it's hard to get around the hindrance of the people of the left, because I know I'm never going to sway them. And I know in South Africa, the leftist whites really get in the way of any sort of progress for y'all. It makes having any sort of impact or change in the world so difficult. But for me, at the end of the day, it's not a matter of just, I like politics or anything. It's just, it's duty bound. It's the duty to the generation that comes after us. We're supposed to, leave a better world for our progeny than ourselves. And there's too many people these days that don't even see anything in that way. They're so relativist, they don't see the point in even having kids anymore. And I just think that's That's really disgusting personally, but
Yeah, it is disgusting. It's a crying shame. But we can make a difference. We really can make a difference, guys. I promise you. Keep doing your work, and you will make a difference. You will change things little bit by little bit by little bit. And over time, you will build around yourselves a hard core of supporters that enables you to obtain the critical mass to make even more of a difference. And again, and so on. There is this multiplying factor, this exponential factor. You have to persist, you have to persevere, and you will prevail, I promise you. Take heart, be courageous, be steadfast, believe in what you know to be right and good and true and beautiful. Believe, continue to believe in the thing that resides inside your heart that doesn't reside in the hearts of other people. Let it be your lodestar. Let it be the thing that takes you forward in years to come, knowing privately, quietly, within yourself that there is something that is morally absolute. And you will make a difference, I promise you.
most definitely. Victory is the only option.
Victory is the only option, otherwise we're going to be subsumed by this thing. You must remember that in moral relativism, in the moral relativist paradigm, it is always relativist. In other words, let's say I'd held this conversation with a time machine, H.G. Wells. Off I go, brrr, and I meet grandfather Hester and grandfather Quesada 60 years ago. And I began speaking about abortion. They would look at me as if I was mentally, there was something wrong with me. Do you see what I'm getting at?
Yeah.
Now abortion is a reality. You guys here in the USA, just as we in South Africa, deal with it as if it's a reality. There's nothing egregiously perverse about it. Well, there is, but it's not how it is addressed. The two of you and I are not camping outside some hospital, throwing stones at cars driving in for abortions, are we? We kind of just tolerate it to some degree. Now, what I'm saying to you is that moral relativism will continue to progress. It won't stop here. And we know, thank God, we have the example of China. Thank the Lord that He has blessed us with reference points. Otherwise, we might struggle to appreciate how severe this thing can be. But imagine if in 60 years' time again, your grandchildren were in a situation where the government was saying to them, you must have an abortion, or your wives must have an abortion, because you're white and you have too much privilege. And you're not allowed to take a job unless 4 black men have turned the job down. And this and that and the other thing. Think for yourselves of the progress that has been made by the left in eroding traditional American values over the past 2 generations. Now extrapolate that by 2 generations. Where does it leave you? With all due respect, guys, please don't take me the wrong way, but I want to use this phrase again. Think for yourselves. What do you think is going to happen? Use your brains, for pity's sake. The writing is on the wall. You already know how this story ends.
Yes.
Yeah.
You only have to use your own minds a little bit, not even a lot, to work out how this story ends.
And we've been seeing just how crazy it's getting in our own society, how unstable it's getting. We are in, I currently believe in the United States, a soft civil war. I mean, I've had to partake in political street violence at this point, but just so many people are blind to how bad it's getting. And you talk about giving up traditionalism. Traditionalism is made out to be such a terrible, horrible thing. Our ancestors were these horrible racist people that were so oppressive. and they see, how we're progressing socially as just this indefinite plane that can only go forward in the terms of the leftist viewpoint. But
Yeah.
it's all based on unfounded, doctrine. What I do know is just there's our ancestors have been doing things the way they have for thousands of years, and it's always worked. And who am I to
Yes.
say that I am smarter and more enlightened than what worked for them? They had to get
Ah,
through a
the
world that is much more difficult than mine. They had to do much more sacrifice than I ever had to. And yet they create a world that I live in, which is so modern and wonderful in many instances. But the people forget at the end of the day we're a civilization, and you can still destroy a civilization. It's happened before.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Sorry, I interrupted you there. I couldn't help expostulating when you mentioned that. It's one of my favorite things. The conceit of, dear me, what is the phrase? The conceit of compound. How did somebody put it to me? The conceit of compound wisdom. Yes, that's the idea that as time goes by, human beings get cleverer. Which is clearly not the case. We live in a time when we have so much knowledge, we're able to achieve so much, but we're bitterly unhappy by and large. If we were that clever, if we were cleverer than our great-grandparents, the first thing we would fix is our own misery, surely. I mean,
Yeah.
So the conceit of compound wisdom, as somebody put it to me, the idea that the generations get cleverer, succeeding generations are cleverer than the preceding ones. Nonsense.
And it's not a new phenomenon. Even Plato wrote about, the younger generation believes that they're so much wiser than their elders. This is something
really?
we've always been dealing with. Just, I guess for some odd reason, our millennial generation just thinks that they're so much better than every single person that came before them. I don't understand it. But we've been going on for a while, and this is getting pretty tangential. Yes. So, why don't you say how people can help and support the Suidlanders, and then we can maybe close this up.
Thank you very much. And I see the clock is racing towards another appointment. We are asking people to donate funds and to, if they wish, invite us to give live presentations to them. Any donations can be made via the PayPal links on our website, which is Suidlanders.org, SUIDLANDERS.org. If anybody wishes us to present, to give one of our live presentations, which is about 3 hours long and which you guys have attended, or which you, Enzo, have twice attended, they should contact me by email at hk at suidlanders.co.za, hk at suidlanders.co.za, and then I'll reiterate the website again. It's suidlanders.org.
Okay. Yeah, I know we're not very rich guys at all. I'm barely able to pay rent. Hopefully I can do it. But we've both given $40, and we've encouraged many people that we know to also donate. I know the situation's just so bad financially in South Africa. You all make every single dollar sent to you stretch as far as it can.
We certainly do, to put it mildly.
There's no other choice, really. But, yeah, I just want to say thank you, Simon, for coming on our show. We're definitely not the biggest show that you've ever been on. I know you've been on Stefan Molyneux, you've been on Lauren Southern. What are some other big ones you've been on?
We've been on Red Ice and a few others, but never mind that. Let me say this. It has been my privilege. You won't see it from my perspective, so I'm not going to, it's pointless me trying to persuade you. But you will, let me just tell you, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I appreciate it very much. And if you'd like me to come on again at any time, hopefully there will be fewer difficulties and challenges, and I won't mess you around as I have done this time, for which I'm very sorry. But I would love to come on again. Anytime you ask, I'll be there.
Oh, thank you so much. We're definitely trying to make something of this podcast and put out some really high quality content. We've been seeing steady growth. People are listening. When we did our Suidlanders episode, we reached over 300 people just on YouTube, and I believe around 20 downloads off our RSS feed. So people are listening, and this does reach people. I'm also sorry, Bobby, that I didn't let you talk so much.
That's perfectly fine.
I do know a bit more about this stuff than you, but
Guys,
yeah, just
I must go. I'm sorry to be so abrupt, but it's past now.
Oh no,
and,
it's all good. Just to close out the show to the listeners, we're still doing the Sunday show. We're gonna have Cameron Croutrone on, who was on our 3rd episode, so it's been a while since he's been on. He's a pretty good guest. He's a pretty good guy, and yeah. Also, if you listener want to help out at all, a review on iTunes would definitely go a long way. I know we currently have 2. We're aiming to get 5, because then I believe you get to have star ratings. But again, thank you, Simon, for being on the show. And with that, yeah, thank you, listener. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.